Well, good morning everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in the series, What's the Future of Living in Bushfire-Prone Regions? I'm Mary Lush, if your screens aren't already telling you that. This series of 3 webinars has been organised by the Friends of Lomne in conjunction with the Aireys, Inlet and District Association, also known as AIDA. We acknowledge the Wadawurrung and the Eastern Ma as the traditional custodians of our region, and in fact they are of the whole Otway region. We send our respects to them and their ancestors, and we look forward to a shared future. Now, just a few things about the way this session will work. Zach Hooper-Travers from the Surf Coast Shire is managing Zoom for us. He'll record this session, and in fact he recorded the last session. And when we have the information, we'll send links to you. But this, don't count on them arriving tomorrow. It may take a little longer for us to get them up. In this session itself, we'd like you to interact with our speakers by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Now you can type a question in there at any time during the session and then press enter and the question's lodged. The questions will be held until both speakers have finished their presentations, at which point Birgitta Hutchins of Forest Fire Management Victoria will take over as facilitator. And she's been assisted by Mandy Baker of the Surf Coast and Colac Otway Shires. And so to our topic, which is broadly unplanned fire. I want to just briefly recap on the first session. At the end of that session, both speakers concluded that the future of living in bushfire-prone regions was change. We heard that hazardous fire conditions are happening more often and that trend will continue. We also heard that if we were to take an evidence-based approach to dealing with the situation we find ourselves in, we need to rethink some of our assumptions. And I think we can add to that as time goes by, we'll need to rethink just about all of our assumptions. Today's session is the drivers of unplanned fires, and it's about how fires get started in the first place and what happens next. Not all fires are equal. Our two speakers are Janet Stanley and Kevin Tolhurst, and I thank them for being willing contributors. Janet will be our first speaker. Janet's from the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne. Now, I haven't been able to find a convenient label to describe her interests because they cross disciplines. She works in social policy, environment and economics. Janet's the principal author of a book called Feeling the Heat, International Perspectives on the Prevention of Wildfire Ignition, which was published a couple of months ago. Her title today is The Human Factors. So Janet, could you take the screen, please?
Yes, thank you, Mary. I'm here. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to sharing a few ideas with everyone. The host has asked you to start your video later. Okay. So I think Zach's going to operate the slides for me. Thank you, Zach. Full screen we need. Great, thank you. All right, so I'm talking about the human factors involved in fire lighting particularly, and I've subheaded it a bit, thinking outside the box, because I think it's new if you like the word transformative that's around a bit at the moment, ideas that we have to take if we're going to beat this fire problem. Could I have the next slide, please? The messages I'd like you to take away, I'll just go through quickly. We're now in a climate emergency already, and we may well be in a bushfire threshold point where there's been a major change in fire conditions. Kevin will no doubt have more knowledge about that than me. But my argument is, if these two facts are so, then we need a commensurate response to this threat, one that moves actions forward to preventing the ignition of fires in the first place, and one that adopts a far wider systemic response to fires. Then I'm going to talk about human behaviour, which I believe greatly impact on the occurrence of fires. Thank you, Zach. Next slide. Thank you. So the biggest impact with the presence of climate change is on these extreme events, whether it's fire or heat or flood. And if you look at the left-hand picture there of Australia, this was the 16,000 odd fires that occurred before we had these terrible fires a bit later on. These fires occurred from the 1st to the 8th of April. That's 1 week last year. And it's not only us, Australia. If you look at our neighbours here, you can see the presence of fires that are dotted all over the countries. The global temperature has risen 1 degree, about a bit over 1 degree since 1910. The trend is for 4 degrees. Look at the fires we're having now and the fires that might occur as the temperature rises. We seem to be in a position where fires can't be controlled as much as they were in the past. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so now we get to the map showing the fires that occurred in the 5 months recently in Australia, September 2019 to 29th of February 2020. Nearly, 960,000 fires occurred. I'm arguing that we're seeing a marked change in fires and fire patterns. Fires are known to be increasing, and they've increased 40% in the 5 years to 2016, which is the latest data I've got about this, and the fire season is extending. We now have a category of catastrophic fires. They can't be extinguished without substantial rainfall, and the fire itself is very erratic in its behaviour. It generates local wind, local conditions, lightning, and very erratic behaviour. The other sort of circular problem that we've got is these fires are actually creating greenhouse gas emissions themselves. So, and in the recent spate of fires, the amount of greenhouse gases generated is almost as much as Australia has in total from other sources, fossil fuels, etc. But we don't seem to recognise this problem as much. Thank you, Zach. Next slide. So what I'm arguing is we need a commensurate response to deal with these fires. One that on the left-hand side of this slide moves actions forward to prevention. So we talk a lot in fire language about planning, preparation, suppression, recovery. We don't talk about prevention much. My argument is we need to move backwards to prevent the fire being lit in the first place. And interestingly, if you look below that, there's a cost curve which shows that while most current attention is up the top end, actually it's also the highest cost. If we can move it back to prevention, actually I believe the costs will be lower. And if we move to the right, what I'm suggesting is that we need a much wider integrated network of approaches to fire. So in the centre there, we need something that integrates all the separate systems that add to the problem around fire, and particularly add the circles, which really aren't there now, about preventing ignition and about land use and environment planning. So urban planning, environment planning needs to be added. Thank you, Zach. So there's a lot of confusion that occurred, especially in these last fires in Australia, about the role that between climate change and human ignition. And this wasn't helped by a lot of bots, mail messages that particularly came from America, unfortunately, which confused a lot of the issues. On the left column there, I say 85% of wildfires are ignited by direct or indirect human activity. And that's very conservative. I note in the planning documents for the 3 shires that have been developed, that they say 95% of fires are actually started by human activity. And the sort of things we're talking about are malicious lighting or arson, reckless fires, which is burning off, power lines falling, causing fire, escaped prescribed burns and other burns, alteration of forests. And if we look at the climate change column on the right, what happens is that while we've always had ignition activity, under conditions of climate change, the fire is now much more dangerous, much more difficult to put out, and much more likely to spread and get bigger. So the weather has been changed, as we've learnt in the earlier talks last week. Changed rainfall, drought, low humidity, lower soil moisture. We've got an increase in lightning strikes as a result of climate change, and very large fires, and the spread of embers are creating new fires. Thank you, Zach. Next slide. So let's look at human behaviour. We can divide it into direct causes as a result of human behaviour and indirect causes. So this particular list is talking about direct causes. And on the left-hand column, I've given reasons for why people light fires, and on the right there, I've given location where the fires are likely to be located, and a little bit about the time and the greatest vulnerability. So the first group who light fires are children to 14. And usually we think about 65% of children who light fires do it out of curiosity. And the location is any urban fringe, after school and in weekends are the most times this happens. Then we've got the group of troubled youth, who are 15 to 24, say. Reckless play, they burn dumped rubbish and cars. They like to cover crime that they've done. They might feel very angry. They might have an inappropriate fire interest. They may also be using substance abuse, alcohol and drugs. Again, this is often with a disadvantaged community on the fringe of an urban area, and it's again after school and weekends this occurs. Then there's the resident or the farmer or someone who's looking for economic gain who might light fires. Clearing, burning rubbish, tractor sparks, forest residue burning, land clearing, and this can occur in any rural forest or private or public land. Then we've got the groups that are travellers associated with vehicles on roads, hunters, campers, timber collectors. Campfire, a vehicle burning may be the problem. And these are in forest and grass areas, often in school holidays, because that's when people engage in these type of activities. Then we've got, moving to the right-hand column, people with criminal intent, which we call malicious fires. So these people have an inappropriate fire interest, problems, poor communication, they might be delusional, they might be covering up crime, and these are mainly occur in any secluded fire area, often trying to get away and not make it obvious, but often close to urban areas. Then unfortunately fire lighters can create a bushfire through an ecological burn or prescribed burn that gets away. And there's a group of, unfortunately, firefighters who like to light fires for many reasons, and this can be in any rural area. And they're often the most dangerous because they understand fire techniques and fire patterns and where other people are going to be. And then finally, in this group, there's the people with an intellectual disability about which we know very little, but it's part of play. It might be fire fascination, might be pure boredom, and this can occur in any rural area. Thank you, Zach. Next slide. So in summary, what I've been saying is there's two reasons for arson. They can be expressive, which is unresolved trauma, or they can be instrumental, which is to achieve another purpose. So this might be revenge, it might be to cover a crime. Usually children, usually male. Sometimes people repeat, they write many fires, but it varies considerably. Child abuse and neglect is often a feature, and they often do it close to home. Thank you, Zach. So this is just a picture graph of people known to the police, and you can see there is a bump if people who light fires, and this is wildfires, do it when they're younger. So there's a trend to do it younger, and fortunately as people get older, they're less likely to light fires. Thank you. Next slide. So in fact, I think that we actually know so little about the cause, but in fact, it's very hard to put someone in one category: accident or poor decisions, reckless or malicious. And I think in fact, it's probably a continuum. So there's a bit of everything, and one particular type of behaviour might slide into another. There might be clear accidents, such as a car bursting into flame on the road, and there might be clear malicious, where it was very obvious the person intended to create a fire, but often they not aware of the extent of their as a result of what they do. They don't intend to light a huge fire, they just intend to achieve an aim of some sort, but it all gets away and out of control. So we're very uncertain about the motivation. The data on this from the various sources isn't consistent. It doesn't have common definitions, so it's very hard to put databases together. Often it's a matter of judgment. Police often don't attend for lack of resources to go to fires. And there's actually 5 times as many fires as what is recorded. So we're looking at about 4,500 fires across Australia a week on average. There's a strong motivation to claim that a fire is actually an accident because the penalty isn't as high. And when fire is creating the biggest cost to society, yet it's the least number of convictions. So we convict very few arsonists. So the conclusion is we don't know a lot about this problem. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so very quickly moving through, of course we've got the indirect causes: lightning, power lines, and spontaneous combustion, which might be in landfill, coal mines, gas leaks, that sort of thing. Thank you. Next slide. So, okay, what do we do about this? So some local and situation fire prevention actions, we can do a lot, which I don't think we're doing nearly enough. And a brief sort of overview of some of the things we can do is we can increase the effort, make it more difficult for people to light fires. We can increase the risk, make it more likely they're going to be caught. We can reduce the awards of lighting fire. So deny any benefits that come from this, such as being a hero if drawing attention to yourself or whatever it is. A lot of fires are lit with in a group circumstance, so actually reduce the power of the group or break the group up so they can't encourage this behaviour. Reduce provocations, remove excuses. So these are, I won't go through all these sub things, but there's many there, like controlling access, blocking off roads, making sure a camping area is well managed and people are aware of what's happening in that campground. reduce emotional arousal is another one. So actually we need to be very careful around the media of how we report a lot of these fires and take the excitement out of it. So if I could have the next slide. So very quickly, possible prevention actions around Lomne. First of all, lobby for action on climate change. Although Lomne possibly doesn't have a lot of the disadvantage that comes in many urban fringe areas, there still are people who are at risk during their lifetime of conducting arson. And then, of course, you've got the big influx that comes with tourism and over the holiday season. We need to do education, advice in schools, campus tourists, closing off access to forested land, such as the big track, which is behind Lomne. Careful about the media and copycat. This is a big problem, copying crimes that are seen through media, games and movies. Prevent hunting, wood gathering and total fire ban days, and organise activities for children at risk that we know are susceptible to lighting fires, such as organising some sort of after school hours, some sort of activity, teaching them woodwork or whatever it is, taking them to the beach. And particularly, it might be worth considering starting a arson prevention group, similar as happens in Gippsland, which is widely represented by institutions in the community, and I'd like to see the local community added to actually address this problem on a local basis. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so I won't go into this because we're out of time, but again, emphasising the need for integration and particularly improvement of data sets and actually making them publicly available, which some aren't at the present. Okay, next. Now, next one, I won't go into that because that was just if I had time. Next slide, please. Okay, the last slide is a blatant advertising of the book. It's the name. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Janet. Janet's work has added a whole new dimension to my awareness about fires. It also makes me, and so I think we need these sorts of systematic studies in order to develop any sort of plans. On a personal basis, you know, we probably all know people who, indeed we may have been those people who have been careless about fire. We probably all know people who for some reason think the rules don't apply to them. And I think we probably have also always tend to think that you know, we do tend to sometimes, I think, to demonise particular groups. And I had an interesting experience with a day tripper one time when I thought it was a total fire ban. And I challenged him. He was lighting one of those charcoal barbecue things. And he said, no, it wasn't a total fire ban. Well, it turned out that he was absolutely right. You know, he was, in fact, obeying the regulations and I was wrong. So, yeah, so, you know, a lot of day trippers do know just what they're doing. We shouldn't, we have to be careful about applying generalisations to individuals. So thanks very much, Janet. That's really interesting. Kevin Tolhurst is our next speaker. Now, I was going to say that Kevin had retired from the University of Melbourne, but in fact it looks like he still has a desk there. I suspect that perhaps it's in an honorary capacity and it's at the School of Ecosystem and Forest Science. But retired or not, officially retired or not, he's obviously still very active in bushfire science. He's made a really huge contribution to modelling the way bushfires have behaved in the past and in predicting how they might behave in the future. And it's my understanding that this includes making predictions about fire behaviour in real time so that it's actually of use to firefighters. So Kevin's title is Case Studies of Fires in the Otways, and I'll hand it to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Mary. I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and I guess my my approach has been always to try and understand fire the best we can, so that we can I guess make better decisions about how things how we should be managing it. So hopefully you can see the presentation there. So to give you my perspective to start with, I'm a fire ecologist with a background in public land management, and the research that I've done in fire ecology has been since 1984, my belief from the beginning was that fire ecology can only be understood if you actually can understand the context of the nature of the fire and the weather and the climatic conditions within which the fire occurs, and where those soils, fauna and flora exist and interact. So understanding fire has been fundamental to understanding its impact on the environment. So fire, weather and climate characterisation is critical. But one of the things I've understood as well, that only long-term and landscape level perspective can really provide a meaningful context for understanding fire ecology and management. So we have to be a little careful about how we interpret what we see now, how we use historic information, and how we look to quite a changed future. If we have a look at some of the historic data for the Otways, so this is basically bushfires, so it doesn't include a lot of smaller fires that the CFA might attend, for example, but this is all related to unplanned bushfires. So since 1972, there have been about 1,100 unplanned fires in the Otway Fire District. And if you look at that graph that I've put up there, you will notice that there's been an average of about 20 fires in the district over the last 40 years or so. But then we can see in about the last 10 years, that's jumped up to an average of about 40 odd fires per year. And what we've just heard from Janet is that a lot of those fires relate to both an increase in human activity, but also the increase in ignition caused by lightning because of the climate change that we see. So there's an increasing issue about fire in the landscape. If we look then at what that means in terms of the area burnt, you'll see that there's not a large area burnt by wildfire in the Otways. The biggest impact that we've had in recent times was Ash Wednesday, when over 40,000 hectares was burnt. And if we look at the extent of fire that or the area that was burnt with the Wye River fire, even though it had a significant impact, was actually quite a small area that was actually burnt. So just looking at those statistics, we have to be a little careful, I guess, about how we interpret that. So this is a map showing the extent of fires going back to 1927 across the Otways. But in fact, there's a large grey area that you might be able to see in the background there, which was the area that was burnt in 1939. And the darker grey area across on the right here is the area that was burnt in Ash Wednesday, the Deans Marsh fire that affected from Lomne through to Anglesea. So what you can see there is a significant part of the Otways has been burnt in living memory. If we overlay that fire history over vegetation types, what we can see here is that the red areas here are softwood plantations, but what I'm more interested in really are the purple and dark green areas. The purple areas are rainforest areas, mainly in gullies and sheltered environments, sheltered from both the weather but also from largely from fires. And the dark green areas are the wetter eucalypt forests. So the main area of those wetter forests are in more the western part of the Otways, but as we go further east, we see more dry forests, so dry eucalypt forest and heathlands, woodlands, and as we go north, likewise a dry forest. And a lot of the fires we see in most years occur in these drier areas rather than the wetter areas. one of the things that's interesting, it's just for our recorded history, there's a significant area from Cape Otway arcing up through this wetter forest that hasn't got a recorded fire history, and yet we know fire has to have been there for the eucalypts to have occurred there. But because we've got these rainforest gullies, we know that the fire occurrence in those rainforest gullies is very infrequent. Otherwise, we wouldn't have those rainforest species present. And it's not that they won't burn. There was an interesting term that Judge Stretton used after the 1939 fires, where he expressed that we haven't lived long enough to our experiences, our lived experiences, and even our what we record isn't a long enough time period to really make an assessment of fire. Tom Griffiths reused that term after the 2009 fires, and he added to it, we still have not lived long enough. And so we have to be a little careful when we're dealing with ecosystems that are long-lived, like the mountain ash forests, which have a lifespan of about 400 years. They exist in locations where fire occur at least once every 300 years or so. But the average period between fires in those forests is somewhere between 75 and 150 years. And so it's important to appreciate that we shouldn't be making judgments and decisions based just on our recent experience when we're dealing with ecosystems that are much older than that. So understanding fire is really quite important. So the occurrence of fire is a function of an ignition probability. So whether that's human or natural, and most natural fire in our case will be lightning. It's a function of having suitable weather conditions. It's a function of having basically enough fuel available to burn. And it's also a function of being in the path of a fire that has started. So that the probability of a fire occurring in a particular location is a function of all of those factors. So if we go back to that data that I showed you before, the 48 years of data for the Otways, you see that the occurrence of fires is very seasonally biased towards the basically summer, autumn period. So October, November, December, January, February, March, April is when most fires occur, because that's when the fuels are dry enough. And this is basically because there's an ample number of ignition sources in the landscape to start these fires. So there's no shortage of ignition. And that's partly what Janet was talking about as well, that there are a lot of ignition sources out there for a whole host of reasons. However, if we look at the area burnt, we see that the majority of the area burnt has been more in February. So December, January, February, March are the time when most areas get burnt. But it's only in February when we have the combination of really severe weather, as well as conditions under drought conditions, if you like, where the flammability of the forest is as high as it is. And that's where the wetter forests become available, not only the drier forests. So what we need to understand is fire is able to integrate and capture 5 sources of energy. So available fuel is the first one, and that's fairly obvious. We need fuel to have a fire. However, the other ones are really important as well. So the nature of the weather, so the wind, the radiation, the temperature, humidity, the effect of recent rainfall, and that's changing because of climate change. So we need to be aware that we've got a changing trend here. But fires are able to capture the strength of the wind, the strength of the radiation, the dryness of the air, and that helps propagate the fire and increases the intensity and the extent of fires. The terrain is important as well, and somewhere like the Otways, it's quite significant because we've got rugged terrain, but the terrain makes the heat transfer process potentially a lot more efficient. It concentrates wind, it helps capture radiation and wind. Same reason why we put solar panels on a roof facing the sun. Some slopes face the sun and they dry out quicker and they get hotter, and that actually helps propagate a fire. Then there's environmental moisture, so the long-term moisture, which varies with drought. And drought is really a deviation from normal, and that's important. So somewhere like the Otways, where you have a lot of very productive areas, in a drought period, that production has produced a lot of potential fuel, and the drought conditions have made a lot of that fuel available. And then there's association with atmospheric stability. So that's where fires are able to develop into large fires quickly and become quite destructive. And in somewhere like a coastal area like the Otways, atmospheric instability is fairly common because of the passage of fronts and troughs. So we'll have a look at a couple of videos of how that all comes to play for somewhere like Aireys Inlet. So this is a fire starting about noon under Ash Wednesday type conditions. Aireys Inlet up until about 5 o'clock looks like it's fairly safe because the fire's heading to the coast. But in fact, as the wind turns a bit more around to the west, the Aireys Inlet becomes quite vulnerable to the fire. So just watching that again. So early in the stage, from 12 o'clock to about 3 o'clock, you would think the fire is going to miss Aireys Inlet. And then gradually the fire becomes closer and closer. It's the flank of the fire, in fact, that hits Aireys Inlet. The wind change that often creates a lot of the impact doesn't actually hit this fire until about 6:30. So Aireys Inlet, for example, is well and truly impacted by 6:30. If we take an aerial view, we see a very different perspective. So exactly the same fire we're talking about now, but initially this fire starting out in the grassland near Werdale. This is just a theoretical fire. This is not a real fire. But what we can see, it's been driven by a northwesterly wind and it runs to the coast quite quickly. By about 2 o'clock, it's run to the coast. And it just gradually spreads for a while until about 6:30, when a wind change hits about now, and you see it really takes off then to the east. And then anywhere downwind of that fire is rapidly involved in the fire and it's a significant impact. So one of the things that's worth looking at is how does that change if we've had more fire in the landscape? So this is a pattern of prescribed burns and fires across the landscape. The same fire now running through that landscape using the simulator. We can see the fire's not being stopped by those prescribed burns and fire scars in the landscape. But what it does do is it significantly slows it down. And if you look very closely at somewhere like Aireys Inlet, you'll see that the orange lines there are what the fire was doing without prescribed burning, and the brown squares and the red dots are the fire with the fire history involved. Aireys Inlet still gets impacted by the fire, but it takes a couple of hours longer and the severity of the impact is significantly less. So it means there are more things you can do to protect the people and the houses in somewhere like Aireys Inlet. And places like Anglesey and Bells Beach and Torquay basically aren't being impacted much at all in this case, under this scenario. So why do we even talk about prescribed burning? Well, it's because fire is a natural part of the landscape in the same way as wind and rain is, and we need to keep a certain amount of fire in the landscape to keep the energy level at a sustainable level. So to summarise, bushfires capture and integrate 5 sources of energy. It's not just about fuel. The wet forests only burn during droughts and when they're impacted by intense fires coming from drier areas. So we can't just look at the wet forests as being inflammable because there are times they're flammable and they're more flammable if the surrounding areas actually produce an intense fire. The Otways is prone to bushfire disasters because of all those 5 sources of energy actually exist, and because of the coastal location of the Otways means that it's going to be subjected more to this unstable weather conditions and the passage of cold fronts. So the coastal location of the Otways means that when droughts occur, even though they may not be that frequent, they're going to be more severe because there's been a greater build-up of energy in the system in the way of biomass, and that biomass has become available fuel to a fire. So the high human activity levels around somewhere like the Otways also means that there's more than an abundance of ignition sources for fire. So fire is going to occur one way or another. So we cannot just expect the past to repeat itself because A, we haven't lived long enough and our climate and environment is changing. So we have to be smarter about looking forward and not hope to just try and prevent fires and just control fires. We have to actually manage fires and live with fires in the landscape. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully we can answer a few questions.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Always very interesting and accessible ways of talking about fire in our local landscapes. My name is Brigitte Hutchins. I work with DELP and I work in a program called Community-Based Bushfire Management. I am actually hoping that my audio is better than the last time we did this. If anyone's got any issues, please let us know. We also have some panellists here. We've got a series of questions. They're actually, as always, coming in thick and fast as soon as I start talking. And what I'll try and do is actually capture some themes and maximise the amount of bang that we've got here by blending some questions. And I apologise if I don't get to everyone's questions. I'd also like to introduce our panellists, who I'm hoping can put their screens on so we can see them. And if Janet Stanley could join us as well, that would be great. So we've got Pete Ashton. Give us a wave, Pete. Pete Ashton, he works with the Surf Coast Shire as Community Emergency Management Coordinator. Him and his team work closely with Surf Coast communities to raise awareness in preparedness response, and they also do relief delivery around bushfires. Pete works in a multitude of projects, and I'm probably not going to cover them all, but they include fuel management, asset protection, and local response. Thanks for joining us, Pete. And we've also got Tim Gazzard. Hey, Tim.
Hey.
He works with DELP in the Barwon Southwest as team leader in risk and evaluation. He and his team monitor and evaluate bushfire risks such as fuel loads and apply multiple values such as biodiversity, impacts on communities, cultural values to model the risks and impacts of bushfire, and then also develop the logic behind planned burns throughout the Otways. So one of his key projects of this year has been developing the strategic bushfire management plan. And in that, he develops, very similar to what Kevin has just demonstrated, multiple modellings or potentials of bushfire impacts. And he also contributes to many state-based programs. Tim is also an incident controller in our incident control centres around the district and beyond. So I really appreciate them being able to join us. The first question that I'm trying to synthesise will go to Janet and I guess Tim as well. Janet, people are asking, can you be a bit more specific about the considerable suspicious fire lighting activity in the Otways? For example, how many cases over a period of time?
Yeah, look, I wish I could. There's evidence that there's considerable, but again, the classification between accident and suspicious is often blurred. And unfortunately, the data sets just aren't, well, some aren't available, so I'm not able to access them. And what happens is that each organisation has its own data set and they don't often relate to one another. So it's actually a very hard issue to resolve. Well, very in a very good way does give public access, but it's also there's a lot of fires that actually aren't investigated, and there's about 5 times as many fires as officially recorded. So it's a very hard thing to actually predict.
Thanks, Janet. And Tim, I'm going to ask you, as someone who works quite locally, and we have discussed the different sources or data around ignition. What's your information on that?
Yeah, look, I don't have the exact numbers, Brigadier, at hand, but I mean, it'd be less than 5% of fires that we know of, and I guess Janet's right there. I mean, we don't, the numbers are sometimes hard to get exactly worked out in terms of not all understanding of what the ignition source was, it can be quite tricky to actually tease that out sometimes. But yeah, it'd be less than 5% of all ignitions that we consider as arson in a definitional sense.
Yeah.
So it's a reasonably low number, and those where there is some suspicion, I guess there is big pole or the police actually do some patrols on some of those bad days that actually start to, I guess, to target known areas where you might have those ignitions potentially start. So.
Can I just interrupt there? One of the problems is that is the data, but work done by the Australian Institute of Criminology in the past puts almost 50% of fires as malicious. But this is across Australia, and it is fairly old data, but it's all we've got. And also, I think Lomne would be a little bit different to an urban edge because there's attached to a big settlement, because there is more fires lit around Geelong, for instance, the outskirts of Geelong, than you'd find at Lomne.
Thank you. I'll go to Kevin, and I'm sure one of our local experts can assist in this as well. So there's quite a few questions around differences of fire in the old growth or pre-European forests around us in the Otways, and the heavily modified forest post-European. So I guess I'm trying to blend the cultural burning practices and our current planned burning practices, and what differences in bushfire that would present to us, Kevin.
Yeah, I guess one of the issues is that what we see in terms of the flammability of forest, typically as a forest, a wetter forest becomes older, it becomes less flammable in a sense because there's less moisture, less sun, less wind gets into that forest situation. Compared with, say, a drier forest that's more open and more exposed. So there'll be more days a year, more hours a day where a more open, drier forest could potentially burn compared with, say, a wetter forest, particularly where you've got rainforest elements. So the wind's not penetrating, it's not drying out as much, and so on. However, you've got to look at really the whole landscape, and so the flammability of the landscape will be dependent, in a sense, on some of the driest elements in the landscape. So traditional burning looks at removing a lot of the most flammable components of the landscape, so the most easily burnt areas. And they're most easily burnt under relatively mild and dry conditions. And even though that doesn't impact on the wetter forests, like the rainforest and the taller forests, directly, what it does do is means that any fire that does occur in those drier parts of the landscape won't have the intensity and the momentum to penetrate into those wetter areas. So we really need to look at the whole landscape rather than look at it as discrete units. And yes, the statistics will show us, as I tried to show in that map before, that the rainforest and those tall, wet eucalypt forests are far less likely to burn, but we know they will. Otherwise, those wet eucalypt forests wouldn't exist. So, and the rainforests are largely there because they're in rain shadow areas, fire shadow areas, and so, but that's a lot about context. A lot of those rainforest areas are relatively small in a landscape context, so they could easily be overwhelmed by a landscape level fire if one was to occur. So managing fire in the landscape is a matter of managing the whole landscape, not just the dry elements or the wet elements or whatever. We have to look at the whole landscape and what that means across multi-decadal sort of time period. Tim might have some.
I guess I can add to that, Kevin. So that's exactly how we look at the landscape, Kevin. Brigitte, we actually do have what we think about as a long-term fuel management strategy that targets the dry fuels, and I guess we've actually identified the wetter forest as actually not being available for planned burning for the most part. So I guess we've got a planned burning exclusion sort of zone over the top of that. But yeah, we really are trying to prevent fires from thinking about where they start and then the movement of fire across the landscape, and having putting multiple barriers, if you like, or disruptions to the fire spreading through the landscape. And that's, if you think about Barongarook and further out to Tomahawk Creek in the west, and all the way across the interface there, coming back towards Forest and Deans Marsh, back through to sort of Durang and Wensleydale towards Torquay there. So we're trying to actually think about, if a fire starts in the grass, can we actually slow the momentum as it comes into the forest environment? And then where you've got sort of a deeper bit of forest, or maybe 20 kilometres, say, between Deans Marsh and Lomne, then we're trying to put multiple planned burn areas through that sort of pathway where a fire might spread. So you're going to do some burning on the north side of the range, but also close to Lomne there, to try and I guess potentially reduce some of the consequence. And that sort of taps into David Lindemeyer's work he was talking about the other day about reducing consequence close to townships as well. So we're trying to do two things there. One is reduce the spread of fire, and so maybe reducing the likelihood of fire actually reaching Lomne, or reducing the momentum when it reaches Lomne, and then also trying to lower the flame heights and reduce the energy close to the township by putting those burns around the town. So.
Okay, I'll just step in here. Birgitta has lost internet access. Something may have happened at Winchelsea. Mandy, are you in a position to select some questions? Mandy, you need to be on.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. Yep.
Sorry. Sorry about that. I thought I couldn't do it. Yes, sorry, Birgitta will be back in a minute, hopefully. Kevin, there are some questions just around the relationship between the fire and just the environmental values and health of the forest. And I know that's a big area of expertise in your experience. So can you just talk a little bit about that for us, please?
Yeah, look, I guess there's, you'll find that there are sort of people almost fit into a couple of schools of thought. One is that people see fire as a damaging process, and therefore is something that ought to be limited and excluded as far as possible. And I don't agree with that. I side more with the traditional owners, in a sense, in saying that fire is a natural part of the landscape, and what's important is to maintain it in the landscape in a sustainable way, so that we can maintain nutrient cycling, regeneration process, competition processes, and so on. So I think we need to, fire is a really important part of the environment, and it needs to be carefully managed. I'm less, I don't like using fire just for fuel management to protect human life and property. I think if we were managing fire in the landscape well to make the landscape as sustainable as it can be, then we would automatically actually reduce the level of bushfire risk to the human life and property as well. So I think the focus ought to be more on the environmental side. However, I know the reality is the funding and the political pressure will be from the human life and property. So we need to marry the two. But one of the things that I found from, I guess, the research that I've done over the years is that the system is, if we give it half a chance, the system is quite resilient to fire. And if we actually look at how patchiness and variable fire is, if we allow it to be, the system actually works quite well with quite regular fire, providing it's done in a uniform way, and I guess in a, what I kindly call an industrial process, but more as a natural process. And in that way, it is very difficult in some of the drier forests to actually overburn those forests, because they have natural barriers to fire, and they create a natural patchiness because of rocks and logs and variations in the flammability of fuel across the ground. But we have to actually work with that natural variation and allow fire to do its work in I guess, a more passive sort of way. And I think that's where we can't go back to total traditional burning of the landscape. There's a lot we can learn from how the traditional owners actually used fire in the landscape, and use some of those concepts and principles in a modern day environment.
Yeah, can I just tack on the back of that, Kevin? Two things there. One was about that multi-values perspective that you just talked about, looking at it from a biodiversity lens, but also looking at it from the human life. And then the strategy we've set up over this long, we think about 40 years into the future as an indicative sort of time frame to manage or planned to. Yeah, it tries to take into account community safety, but also the environmental outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. But other things too, thinking about things like water catchments and how they may be impacted by fire, or industry, so plantations and agriculture, and how they may be impacted by fire. So it's trying to balance those things out. And I guess the second point I just wanted to make there was about that sort of use of frequent low intensity fire, if you like. Cool fire maybe is how we sometimes talk about it, but we sort of just embarked on a bit of a journey to get ourselves more in that space and do more. Over the last 2 years, particularly in the Anglesey Heath, we've really started to embrace that idea of what we think about as fine scale mosaic, sort of burning 10 to maybe 30 hectares of area, just by wandering around. And in the later part of the season, so into the winter, we sort of did maybe 10 different times over winter. We went out when it was a sunny day and burnt just for 3 or 4 hours, and then it goes out overnight. So starting to explore how we can actually implement fire by using a shorter time frame, and I think that also play into the climate change. So we're starting to try and work with what climate might throw at us and be prepared for that as much as we can.
And can I say also that if feral animals are a problem after a fire, control of the feral animals, and also, as David pointed out last week, control of some species that preclude others after fire. So there's actions, environmental actions that can be done after fire to improve the ecological well-being.
Yeah, it's similar to what David Lindemeyer was saying. We do have a baiting program that is happening in the Otways, across there for foxes in particular. So yeah, it's something that you can always do more, but we're definitely trying to work in that sort of land management space where you're applying fire, but also thinking about some of the other things maybe going on in the landscape at the same time.
So if you've got any extra comments to add to that, Pete? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, we with the show, I guess we're kind of trying to concentrate more on that urban interface and sort of working with the sort of bigger picture. And I guess some of that will be sort of teased out a bit more next week, but that's probably our focus rather than sort of delving right into some of the landscape type issues.
Can I just perhaps ask a question of Peter in a sense? Is one of the things that I think is a bit of a conflict in a sense is the pressure from people living in settlements and so on, sort of wanting a level of protection. There's probably a lot that can be done around interface areas with the community and the local government and so on to actually provide a level of protection there, and whether that's directly from the fire or by the actions and the plans that are put in place. So I think there's a major role to play by the local communities in basically providing some level of bushfire protection for themselves that actually takes the pressure off the broader environment, the broader landscape as well. So maybe Peter, you could make some comment along.
Yeah, look, I think that's definitely progressing like quickly, and I'll give you an example of that. Just in the last year, we sort of teamed up with DELP and CFA to expand the asset protection zone. So those sort of fuel reduced areas around the town that were put in on the public land around 2008. So we've taken on a project to investigate how that would look on the remaining private land. And there's been broad acceptance with that, so that the project has actually finished investigating what that will look like. And so hopefully we're moving into a sort of a implementation phase as of the end of this year and next year. Whereas back 10 years ago, there was quite a lot of opposition to that. I haven't seen that this time. I think there's a realisation that that there are big gains to be made in fuel management at the interface and within properties themselves. And the other thing we've seen too is that by changing that vegetation it's not a death sentence for it either. It's just changing a structure and it's giving us some other values. So I think that's starting to be seen. There are big gains still to be made with vegetation around people's properties, and it's something that's slow to be taken up by people because it's a real, when we live down here, there's a real sense of identity with our gardens and the interface forest, and that's a bit of it's a change that needs to happen, part of all all of what's going to happen in the next 20 years, but it's one that it is hard for our communities to get our heads around. And we do focus a lot in that space, trying to sort of make that change. And I think we're just starting to see some steps into it.
Can I just say that this is also going to be covered in next week's webinar, or next Thursday, or this Thursday's webinar with Justin Leonard. There is a comment here that correlates with this, and it's from a CFA firefighter who is concerned that people who live in our townships don't actually understand the impact of ember attack, which I suppose Wye River was certainly demonstrated back in 2015. Do you want to just touch on that briefly and just people that this Thursday will be covering a lot more of that?
You're talking to me, Birgitta?
Yes, I am.
Yep. Yeah, sorry. I think we find there's just a broad sort of lack of understanding about the risk of people. And a lot of that risk does relate to that ember attack and how you maintain your vegetation and how you maintain your house. So yes, I see that's an area where we're trying to build up that sort of understanding of risk and how fire interacts with your property. And it's difficult, and it's going to take some years for sort of people to get their heads around that and understand kind of what their responsibilities are living in this landscape. And I'm sure Justin will touch on that a lot more later in the week.
Sorry.
One of the things, the simulation that I quickly showed in my presentation, was that you could actually see the ember attack occurs a long time before the fire front actually gets there. And I think people don't appreciate how important that's still part of the fire. It's not just the flaming front that is actually impacting on people. So it's important to provide that sort of visual understanding that the spotting process is critical. And as others have said, that the Wye River is a great example. There was basically no fire front that came into Wye River. It was all spot fire. Embers came in and spot fire starting. That's where most of the losses occurred, was from spotting, not from some wall of fire impacting on the settlement.
Praise for the panel and for our speaker.
I think we might have just lost Birgitta again. Mary, maybe you could.
Yes, so I think we have
our questions now. There's been a lot more other questions. Maybe we asked if you'd like to send an email at the end. There's an address at the end of the presentation.
Well, I think that what I'll do, everybody that's registered, I'll send some emails out with addresses that you can use to pursue these topics if you want to. Birgitta, you're back. Would you like to wind up for us?
Sure thing. I'm sorry. This is actually a great demonstration of how technology is not going to get us through, even on a calm day. So increasing our knowledge and awareness about bushfire risk is really important. You want to wind up now, Mary? I thought we had a bit more time.
Well, we can go a bit longer. I'll just leave it in your hands.
I'm aware that my internet connection is unstable. The computer is actually saying that. So look, there was a question around a study that was done by Earl and Simmons, Earth Sciences Department in Melbourne Uni, talking about satellites. I don't know if Kevin or Tim would like to talk to that, if Kevin is still on.
Were you looking at fire ignitions through satellite imagery?
No, this was satellite imagery of live fires. And
well, that's Kevin's area.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of part of what happens is when you have an inquiry or Royal Commission or whatever, a lot of evidence comes to light, and people say, well, if we knew all of this, why weren't we making better decisions at the time? And the reality is that a lot of that information wasn't being collated in one location. It was, some people had some information, some other people had other information, and when you put it all together, it paints quite a useful picture. But during a fire event, often that's not all in one location. So satellites, so we now have basically geostationary satellites, so we can actually get updated information about every 10 minutes of where the fire is and what it's doing. So that information needs to be collated and distributed more quickly so people have a better idea of what the fire is actually doing. So in the same way as I tried to demonstrate poorly probably with that video in my presentation, if you can get an overall picture of what the fire is doing, you can make better decisions. So this new geostationary satellite system can be incorporated into the public warnings and the public information. I think last year in New South Wales, they probably did that much better than Victoria. Victoria puts out verbal warnings and some historic sort of maps of where the fire was, but it needs to be more in real time. And I think the technology of using satellites, but also even just things like triple-O calls, the incorporation of discussions on social media. There are a multitude, in fact, of sources of information that need to be collated. That's a bit of a technical issue, but then it needs to be made public so that the broader community has access to that information. And there's quite a hurdle to get over from a bureaucratic and a political point of view to share that knowledge because, well, the community won't understand that and they'll be making poor decisions. You think, well, we shouldn't be too paternalistic about trying to shield and help protect people when people can make their own decisions if they're given good information. So I think there needs to be a shift in the culture in terms of how much information is provided, and more technology like the satellites is ought to be made in a digestible form readily for community people.
I couldn't agree more about that, Kevin, because it's the public needs to be informed about a great deal of these things, and in some cases that's not happening.
Can I just give a real example of how we use satellites this year? For a local fire, we had a Jellybrand Boggy Creek fire. It was a 350 hectare fire, but as you may recall, over the summer it was very smoky from the fires in Gippsland and New South Wales. And on that particular day, we had a band of lightning go through the Otways. It started about 5 or 6 fires, and we actually couldn't use any of our normal detection methods. So we have towers up on those days where we expect to have lightning. We also have aircraft that do what they call a bird dog run. So they fly around the Otways in a circuit and they feed back intelligence back to our incident management teams. But none of those sources were available to us because of the smoke. So we actually detected one of our fires, the biggest one, the Jellybrand Boggy Creek fire, using these geostationary satellites, a hotspot. And that was, we actually responded crews based on that information. So we are using these data sources. Can we use them better? But potentially we can. And I think that's some of the inquiries are probably talking about how that may happen. But I think we've got some of this technology. It's definitely not, we're not using it. It's just, can we use it more? Then maybe the answer is yes to that. But they're a really important source of information for us. And I worked over in Gippsland on the fires this year, and we also used them for those days where it is very smoky and some of our traditional methods aren't as effective.
Good to know, Tim. I actually really agree and support the idea of shared understanding and shared knowledge is the only effective way of planning and preparedness. And just the examples that have been provided through this webinar are awesome. We've recorded it, so we'll be able to put it up there on a platform for participants to share with other people. I think we should wrap it up now. And I really want to thank both Tim and Pete for being our local expert panelists. Really contributed a lot to the conversation. And I just want to ask one question of our presenters, both of them each. So Janet, the question is, what do you see as the future of living with unplanned fire in high-risk areas?
I think it's pretty grim, actually, and I think that we need a huge change in how we approach it and what we do. And I think we need to bring in a lot more people who understand it and who can help, a much wider group of people. Unfortunately, we've left a lot of these issues to the fire brigade and we expect them to be an expert in everything. And I think there's a lot of people and a lot of broader viewpoints that should be brought in and should be considered a lot. and involved. And I also strongly think that we should involve the local community a lot, because they know a lot about their area. They know the vulnerable spots. They know who's vulnerable. They know who's actually going to light the fire, because when you talk to a community after a fire, they often say to you, oh, I thought that person might have been out lighting fires. I should have done something about it. So I think we can use, we don't want to pick on people by any means, but I think the problem is going to be so great that we have to actually do a lot more collective action around this.
Yep, definitely. Valuing local knowledge, very important. Kevin, can I ask you, what do you think the future of living in bushfire-prone areas is looking like?
Well, it's clear with climate change there's going to be more fire in the landscape, and we've got two choices, two paths to take. And if the Royal Commission that is currently deliberating on its final report is any guide, it's really pushing us down the path of having more big government, paternalistic sort of approach, where we get more aircraft, more firefighting, we'll look after you sort of approach. And I think the other option really is to have a more community focused and all shared responsibility sort of approach, where the community is engaged more. And that's more about information and empowerment and policy and legislation. It's quite a different approach to this. We're going to get more firefighters, more aircraft. That firefighters aircraft thing has been more politically and industrial sort of union driven, because it's more funding for their organisations, whereas the community is going to benefit a lot more from a better understanding of their environment, a better use of fire in the landscape, a better understanding of what's important locally, if you like, and everyone taking some share of the responsibility. So in the same way as what Janet is saying, there needs to be a more community involvement. I think we need to be turning the politics around here, and that can only come from communities agitating and talking to their local members and so on, to make sure that we don't end up with this failed, it's been a proven failed process. Look at America, where they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on firefighting, and they've made the situation worse. If you actually compare what's happening in California with what happens across the border in Mexico, where they spend next to no money on firefighting, that it's a sustainable fire management process in Mexico, where they don't have the resources and the aircraft and so on, and yet the amount of fire area burnt is very similar, but there's no disasters to speak of, because they don't get these large, intense, out of control fires because of what's a failed fire management paradigm. So we really need to shift our thinking, especially with the pressure that climate change is going to bring on us. And so people living in fire environments like the Otways, but there are many in Victoria, many in Australia, we need to be really pushing our political masters in a direction that involves the community a lot more, and we need to have a more holistic view of fire and fire management rather than just control, because we can't control it. We're kidding ourselves if we can control it, but we can manage it and we can live with it.
Yep, very interesting from both of you. So once again, I'd like to thank Janet Stanley and Kevin Tolhurst for presenting and really being involved in this great discussion, which I'm sure we could continue on with, but everyone's time's limited. Zach, if you could put up the second last slide just to promote next or this Thursday's events. So this will really continue that conversation and bring it into that much more local, I guess. You know, we've gone from the climate change, the landscape from last week to today with the landscape and ignition sources, the human factors. Next week, we're going to be looking with Barbara Norman at planning and community resilience, and Justin Leonard, who is looking at managing that urban interface of our townships. So that's 3 p.m. Thursday. It'd be great to see you all there again. The next slide, Zach, will actually show you, give you all an email address. I'd suggest if you want to just take a photo with your phone, it's my name. Just for any follow-up, any questions, queries, you can also get in touch with Friends of Lomne or Ada if you've got their contact details, which have both of their websites are in front of you. So that really wraps up our session. I'd like to thank once again the presenters, Janet and Kevin, and our panelists, Pete and Tim. Big thanks, and we'll see you all Thursday.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye now.